Good evening, good evening. Hi, I'm Alec Baldwin, and we have a program this summer that we call, as you know, the Hamptons Institute, kind of a lofty name, perhaps borrowed from the Aspen Institute by my predecessors. We had these programs, I'm told, for about 4 years, and then we had a bit of a lull, a gap, and we brought it back again this year. How many of you came to the program last Monday, which was about the presidency? Yeah, great. Had a wonderful panel with Howard Dean and John Podhoretz, Katrina, and John Laval from Up Island, Republican John Laval, who I think is the son of Ken Laval, right? And then next Monday we have one that is not to be missed as far as I'm concerned, an assessment of the Obama presidency hosted by Katie Couric with Bill O'Reilly. Give me a moment. Give me a moment. If you want to get up and co-host with me, just give it a name. Bill O'Reilly, Monica Crowley, Kurt Anderson, and we have another, I'll get you the other name later. We filled in our last participant. So that's going to be an assessment of the Obama presidency next Monday, our last program on the 29th. Tonight, and this program was conceived prior to Scalia's death, to Justice Scalia's death. We have a program about the Supreme Court and the role of the Supreme Court in our society and in the election. We have a wonderful panel. I told all of them only because I've helped produce, with a bunch of other people, I've helped produce all three of these shows and try to cast them, if you will. But this is the one I'm moderating, so just purely for my own vanity, I decided to announce today that these three men coming out here are the foremost experts in the field that they work in. You are here to hear the foremost experts in the field that they work in. So we're going to bring them out one at a time. Please help me welcome Michael Keegan from People for the American Way.
Thank you.
And Adam Liptak, who covers the Supreme Court for the New York Times. And Michael Waldman from the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Have a seat, guys. So we were talking about just kind of spitballing some things backstage. I can't believe I used that word spitballing when talking with experts about the Supreme Court. But and one of the things that came up was what kind of people get nominated to come to the Supreme Court? And I wanted you to talk about that first. What kind of people?
Well, these days we're used to the idea that it needs to be maybe a judge, an appellate judge, very focused on the minutia of the law, the footnotes. That's not the norm. That's not the way it's been throughout most of American history. In the past, we've had governors, public interest lawyers, senators, and often those folks have brought to the court outside real-world experience that the rest of the justices wouldn't have.
What about you?
So it's these days, a very highly credentialed, formalistic court of logicians, not always fully endowed with the common sense that all of you guys have. Just one data point, it's astounding. I don't know how many law schools there are in America, 200, 300. Every single member of the current Supreme Court attended Harvard or Yale law schools. Those are good law schools, but that gives you a sense of how narrowly cast the current Supreme Court is.
What's your opinion?
Well, I certainly think that this gives us an opportunity to really diversify. I mean, I think Obama's done a fantastic job in terms of getting a lot more diversity, in terms of racial diversity, in terms, has had a lot more influence on getting better racial diversity, many more women, many more people of color, which has been absolutely tremendous. But I think the next phase is to get people who've had different kinds of experience that they can bring into the courts, because they represent us. They should look more like the people and not like people who went to Yale. But
now, Adam, you mentioned when we were speaking earlier about what we lost when we lost Scalia. How would you characterize that?
So ideologically, he was not everybody's favorite justice, but for a journalist, he was fantastic. He was always quotable. The arguments were always lively. I'm prepared to say he was also jurisprudentially quite influential, that some of his theories about how to interpret the Constitution, how to read statutes, have had enormous influence. But when we lost Scalia, the court became a much grayer place, much less fun to cover. We'll talk some more about what an 8-member court is like, but a court without Scalia is a very different affair than the one we had before February.
He was the preeminent articulator on the court of originalism, or as he called it, textualism. The idea that the only legitimate way to understand what the Constitution means is to ask, what did it mean back then? What did it mean to those folks in the powdered wigs in most instances?
And how did they get away with that?
He said that this was a way to avoid politics in the court, avoid tilting to the left or the right. Some of us don't think that's exactly how it worked out. But what's interesting is Chief Justice, he was more influential in so many ways off the court than he was on the court. Rehnquist, when he was Chief Justice, would not let Scalia write the big opinions mostly because he would so alienate the other justices with some of his incendiary asides that he would lose votes. The only really major case that bears his mark of originalism is the Heller case, the 2008 case interpreting the Second Amendment that found for the first time that it reflected an individual right to gun ownership. But it's been in all of our minds of how you interpret the Constitution. We all go back for those founding fathers quotes, and when you find one, it's a gem. And that's his implication.
I completely agree with you. Heller is his most important, perhaps his only really important majority opinion. But one interesting thing about Heller, 5-4, the usual division between conservatives and liberals. The liberals, when they responded in long dissents, also responded on originalist grounds. Mm-hmm. Said, no, the framers back then meant muskets, or whatever they said, but they didn't respond in an evolving Constitution kind of way. They fought Scalia on his own terms, which is some evidence that his way of thinking about the Constitution was in fact influential.
I would just add one thing about Scalia. When he passed, I mean, the fact that he passed in a presidential election year when he did, the ramifications of that, the possibilities of changing the court for the next generation, which doesn't happen very often in American history, really can't be, overestimated. I mean, it's a tremendous change. And by the way, the panel that was conceived of before he passed, and then Garland was appointed, and then Trump got the nomination, I thought, my God, they are doing everything they can to promote interest in this panel in the Hamptons in August, and really did an incredible job at that, because, I mean, here we are. I mean, it could not be more top of mind, and people are talking about the Supreme Court in ways that they've never talked about it before. So I think his passing is really an incredible landmark in terms of the history of the court. And regardless of what you thought of him, we put out a very nice statement when he passed about wishing his friends and family and condolences. And we got a lot of people saying, "How could you say that about Scalia?" Even one nice thing.
Now, explain to me as a person, I'm not immersed in the law and I don't have a law degree and so forth, but when you talk about the Second Amendment and Heller and gun ownership, why do you think, what's the most cogent argument that Scalia or anybody on the court has made about, we regulate everything else. We regulate cars. You can't get in a car and drive a car. You can't go to a pharmacy and take medication and self-prescribe. We regulate most aspects of our life to a fare-thee well. And yet we can't stop people from getting guns. How have they succeeded at doing that? Adam.
Well, I guess I would say that they found a constitutional right, like the right to free speech. Free speech can be regulated. And there's a big fat paragraph at the end of the majority opinion in Heller where it suggests that all kinds of regulations are indeed possible. And I'm sure Scalia didn't happily write that. I'm sure that was the price of a fifth vote. For the longest time, I thought it was Kennedy. Now I think it might have been Roberts. But somebody insisted on leaving open the idea that you can have fairly robust regulation. And in fact, in the wake of Heller, there have been lots and lots of challenges to gun control laws, and they have almost all failed. And the Supreme Court has, since 2010, gotten out of the business of the Second Amendment. So there's an argument to be made that it was more symbolic than anything else, and that it didn't change the landscape so fundamentally. So jurisdictions that want to regulate guns largely can, but that's not every jurisdiction.
I think that's exactly right. It is not the Second Amendment that is the obstacle to sane gun laws. It's political will. I wrote a book on the Heller case. I don't think Scalia's history could pass the first 10 feet of muster. When you walk into the lobby of the NRA headquarters in Virginia, they have on the wall the Second Amendment. They just cut out the part about the well-regulated militia, and that's basically what Scalia did. But when, as Adam said, when you strip away the pretensions of his historicism, it was actually a very limited decision. It said that there is an individual right, but as with all rights, it can be limited. The justices have now turned down 60 opportunities since then to hear Second Amendment cases. And the lower courts overwhelmingly are saying, yes, there's an individual right, some of them happily, some of them grudgingly, but society has a right to protect itself also. And there's basically a settled judicial consensus. And a lot of the people who brought the Heller case are unhappy about this. They say, as Justice Scalia did, that this is like massive resistance in the South after Brown versus Board of Education. But it really suggests that even liberals, even people who want stronger gun laws, can live with Heller. And in the last couple of months, the liberals on the court signaled that they have no intention of overturning Heller. There was an 8-0 ruling that applied Heller and its original right to a gun matter. So one of the maybe surprises of even a liberal new justice or two is that they're not likely to suddenly rip that one up to shreds.
Has people for the American way weighed in much on the gun issue?
Well, it's interesting. I think in terms of, that's absolutely right in terms of what cases go before the Supreme Court. And I think people don't often bring questions to the Supreme Court that they don't want an answer to, which often defines what goes to the Supreme Court. And it is absolutely incredible outside of the courts that it's really not a courts issue because it's such a very, very strong political issue. I mean, we're involved to the extent of pointing out the fact that what happened to the rest of the Constitution. I'm sure you probably have seen that little cartoon that says the right wing's view of the Constitution is blah, 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 Second Amendment, and then it's blah, blah, blah for the rest of the time, because there's often a belief that that is actually the core of the Constitution. So it's more of a political problem. I'm glad that it's being debated. For a while, politicians, certainly on the Democratic side, wouldn't touch it. That has changed in this election.
Right.
I think you've all heard Hillary Clinton speak very clearly about it, and I think it actually allowed her to go to the left of Bernie Sanders in the primary.
What's it going to take to get sane gun laws in this country? I'm using that, that's my language. I'll take that again, ready? What's it going to take to change the gun laws in this country?
Political persistence, not judicial diktat by either side. What you've had is in the way the Supreme Court changed its view on this is actually kind of a classic story of how constitutional change really happens, which is the NRA and other gun rights advocates waged a 30-year campaign to persuade the public that there really is a constitutional right, and thus ultimately persuade the court, so that when they finally issued that ruling, it sort of fell like a ripe apple from the tree. It wasn't ultimately that controversial. Unfortunately, until recently, groups and forces fighting for stronger gun laws, they would run into opposition, they would run into a filibuster or something like that, and they kind of pull back. But when you think about it, after the horrible tragedy at Newtown, and there was the bipartisan bill, the Manchin-Toomey bill, to strengthen the background check, and it lost. And everyone said, how could it possibly lose? It had a majority. It was the Senate's filibuster rules. It was the fact that they didn't bring it up again. So there's no substitute for the hard grinding forward of public opinion.
Do you think that Obama has led in terms of changes in gun laws, especially in the second term? A lot of people
certainly
died
not
in
the first term.
country.
He's led a bit, but I think it will require more leadership.
What about you?
I heard someone once say, what's it going to take to change gun laws? You'd have to shoot a member of Congress in the head, and then they said, wait, that happened. That was Gabby Giffords. And it still didn't change. So I don't know. I mean, the NRA is very powerful. Many, many people across the country have a completely different view of guns than people on the coast do. They really view it as a fundamental constitutional right. And they have been talked into believing that even minor adjustments in the direction of sensible safety measures are a general threat to their ability to have 50 guns in their homes. And I'm not sure what you do about it.
I think we got to win by winning. I think the important thing
That's a strategy.
It is a strategy. No, because it's not about, because I think if we were having this argument 10 or 20, or discussion 10 or 20 years ago, we would be saying, maybe talking about it in this way, or maybe making it less threatening, or maybe doing this law or that law. But I think it is about, winning elections. I think it's great that it's being discussed. I think there's going to be a mandate for some change, and we can, if, it's going to take a long time. I think the NRA is extremely powerful, but not as powerful as they are often propped up to be. I mean, I think it's going to be about every community that is becoming empowered in this new American majority, Latinos, African Americans. I mean, they want common sense gun laws. And Republicans, 80% of the people were for background checks. So that just shows that there has to be a change in Congress before, it's not going to be doing everything the same way with the same people there, because otherwise it's not going to change. It's going to be about electoral change, and I think that, this could be an interesting year and a step in the right direction in that regard.
How would you evaluate Hillary Clinton's positions on changes in gun law?
Well, I think it's great that she made it an issue. People have been so afraid of it, particularly Democrats, ever since 2000, because people can debate whether it's true or not that Al Gore lost because he lost states like Tennessee over Second Amendment issues. And now she's talking about it again, which I think is really great. It's not being buried and if an issue is not discussed in an election, it's definitely not going to happen. But there are many issues that are going to go before the courts, like Citizens United and all that is now being talked about very overtly, what side, certainly what side, she's on, and the types of justices, for example, she's going to appoint based on issues like that. So I'm excited that the debate has happened. I think Bernie Sanders was really healthy to really have the debate on many of those issues that needed to come to the fore.
We talked earlier backstage, and I want to change the subject to this idea of the 8-member court and how you evaluate the performance and the limitations of the 8-member court.
So Justice Byron White famously said, every time the court gets a new member, it changes the internal dynamic and it's a new court. It turns out you subtract a member, you also have a brand new court, a wholly different dynamic. Now, what you might have expected from an 8-member Supreme Court is lots and lots of 4-4 ties. And we got several, and including in important cases about immigration and public unions, there were 4 in total. But 4 is really not that many. What it really made them do is issue a lot more narrow rulings. It put Kennedy out of the center spot and elevated Justice Stephen Breyer's role. And it did result in this 8-member court, from which we didn't expect very much, did issue 2 very important, quite liberal decisions, one on abortion rights, one on affirmative action. So when it was capable of moving, it moved pretty hard and to the left. When it was incapable of moving, it deadlocked, or it decided cases on such narrow grounds that I got press releases from both sides saying they just won a fabulous victory.
One of the things that happened, and you never know how much of an impact oral argument and the atmospherics around oral argument will have, but Scalia was such a voluble, forceful presence, he tended to dominate frequently the oral argument. And in the abortion case, it was the women justices who held the floor and really eviscerated the phony rationales, as the court ultimately decided, behind the Texas abortion law. And that alone, that change in the atmosphere had a big impact. At the Brennan Center, we're engaged in a lot of the litigation on issues, especially on democracy issues, where I think the court has been more aggressive and frequently more wrongheaded than on anything else. But my whole career as a lawyer has been thinking about how to keep cases out of the Supreme Court. And conservative counterparts would be spending their time on these long jurisprudential drives to get cases into the Supreme Court. And with a 4-4 tie, as many of you know, if there's a tie, the lower court ruling holds. It doesn't have the impact of being a precedent, but it's the law. And so this absence of Justice Scalia, as was said backstage, came in the middle of the play. Yes. And there were a lot of cases where conservatives thought they were getting their big chance and suddenly discovered they didn't have the votes. But it's forced everybody to do what they might be thinking about in the back of their mind in election season, which is to envision an entirely new era.
Where you're going to want to take cases to the court. I mean, if there's another progressive justice appointed to the Supreme Court, groups like the Brennan Center and the ACLU, which have tried like crazy to keep cases out of the court for fear of bad results, will all of a sudden be trying to figure out how to chip away at Citizens United, how to chip away at the Heller Second Amendment case. It'll be an entirely different atmosphere, and one that, if Hillary Clinton wins, is a foregone conclusion.
So someone mentioned to me about Citizens United, because we're going to talk about that more later. And I'm not a lawyer, I don't read these opinions, and I'm relying on their interpretation, what they said. They said that they thought that Roberts, he wrote the majority opinion in Citizens United, Roberts?
No,
Kennedy.
But he thought that I guess it was Kennedy, when they wrote that opinion, what they were basically doing was encrypting in that decision how they could go off and eventually kill all campaign finance laws. Like, here's a decision, we're not going to give you everything you want. But in the writing of this opinion, we're going to instruct you about next time you come back how you're going to get it right. Did you read that into that opinion at all?
Well, it was a pretty sweeping opinion on its own terms. Right. And when we talk about Citizens United, it's a bit of a brand name for all the recent Supreme Court opinions deregulating money in politics. Right. It's like Kleenex. You know, not all tissue, sanitary tissues are Kleenex, but it had within it dicta, as it's called, in other words, powerful language that doesn't have the force of law, that then is what a lower court took to create super PACs. That's true with any Supreme Court decision. It's one of the fascinating things about the role of the Supreme Court in the United States. It's very unusual. Other countries don't have it this way. Goes back a long way. Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s said, in the United States, trying to explain us to Europe, sooner or later, every dispute ends up a lawsuit. And that was then. And now we're more and more grounded in this, and whether that's a good thing or not is a real significant question to debate. But every paragraph has a line of cases in it.
Well, I think your friend is quite right that there was some time bombs in Citizens United. And I also agree that Citizens United is a kind of shorthand, a caricature. It was a reasonably important decision, but it wasn't Citizens United that injected money into politics overnight. That's been a long-standing issue. But there were some statements in Citizens United like independent spending can never corrupt. So I can spend $10 million to support a candidate, and there's no way that's going to corrupt or influence the candidate. And also that influence and ingratiation are not corruption. So there were some very broad and sometimes counterintuitive propositions that were just blandly set forth by Justice Kennedy as he wrote that opinion.
But I know that people, and again, I'm only going to give you the overly simplistic kind of view of this, but the friends of mine would say, over dinners and so forth about Citizens United, hating Citizens United and wanting to overturn Citizens United, they would say, here we're going to give corporations all of the rights and they have none of the responsibilities. They don't want to pay their taxes. They don't want to clean up the messes that they make. How do you view individually, each of you, I'll start with you. How do you view the consequences of Citizens United?
I think they're enormous. And by the way, that Supreme Court case that they got, I think they had their decision ready and then they got a case that could match it, which really didn't have a lot to do with what the actual court case that was in front of it. I mean, it seemed that it was an accident waiting to happen. I think that concept of saying that corporations, have rights of free speech and the fact that, there was that comment going around that, they'll believe that people have freedom of speech when a corporation can be, put to death for executing people. I mean, is that going to happen? I think it was a disastrous decision of which, overturned 100 years of laws regulating campaign finance, and I think it's a scourge. I think it's going to be, I think it's really important that the next Supreme Court will be, or in a couple of years is going to be dealing with cases that will change that around. So I think it's a critically important decision that's done incredible harm to our democracy. Yes, there's always money in, and it's always a constant battle to regulate it, but I think this particular case was incredibly detrimental to democracy.
So I'm going to say something heretical. There's a decent First Amendment argument for Citizens United. It certainly wasn't the first time the court had said that corporations have First Amendment rights. It was perhaps the 20th time the dissent from John Paul Stevens acknowledged that corporations have First Amendment rights. And if corporations didn't have First Amendment rights, it would be a big trouble for the New York Times Company, which is a corporation.
When Citizens United came down, one of the things that alarmed so many of us was that it ended the 100-year difference in how the law treated corporations and natural persons when it comes to spending money to try to influence elections, going all the way back to the time of Teddy Roosevelt. But that has not turned out to be the thing that has had the biggest impact yet. It's this idea that you cannot have corrupting impact from purportedly, supposedly, pretend independent expenditures. And I always quote Groucho Marx, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? I mean, we've seen the explosion. All you have to do is say, oh, don't worry, it's independent. We use the same consultant. We follow the same strategy. We're all in the same room. The candidate is raising the money for the independent super PAC, but don't worry, it's independent. The Supreme Court says that's all you have to say. So it has actually unleashed a dystopian new era with money in politics. But it goes back well beyond, none of us, I certainly would not want to roll back the clock all the way to January 2010. The Supreme Court, going back to the 1970s, some of us believe, made a big mistake in the way it treated this issue. The key case was called Buckley versus Vallejo. And it said this campaign spending is speech, and it should be treated just like any other First Amendment protected activity. But the only reason it's okay to regulate it ever is corruption. And for a long time, corruption was defined pretty broadly, but now what they've really done is narrow the idea of what could possibly be the kind of corruption that would justify this impingement on speech. Is basically, if you've got a videotape of someone handing someone a bag of money, that's corruption. Everything else is, as Justice Roberts said, the American way. And so part of what those of us who are working to undo the damage of Citizens United and undo the damage of Buckley versus Vallejo is to say, well, what are the other rationales for having strong election laws? And actually, even the four justices who dissented in the recent campaign finance case actually put forward one. They said you need to be able to protect the integrity of elections. And that's its own value. Yes, it's speech, but we also have to be able to treat elections to make sure they have integrity. So I think this, of all the areas, there's going to be tremendous ferment in the next few years.
Well, it's through my relationship with your institution. I met Josh Rosencrantz, your predecessor, and Bert Newborn years ago. This is 20 years ago, when I got immersed in campaign finance reform issues in Arizona, and going up to Maine, New York City's campaign laws, going up to Maine to raise money for the Legal Defense Fund for the Clean Campaign law that they passed up there. And being educated by them, being instructed by them, two wonderful people. And Newborn teaching me that Buckley Vallejo was a decision that was rushed into place for the '76 election because of the crimes committed during Watergate. Mm-hmm. And all the scandals involving the funding of that '72 campaign. And it was a decision that was rushed. There was a lot of holes in it, a lot of problems with it. And the idea was that they wanted to say to people that a direct contribution by me to you of a certain amount, that's corruptible. Right. So I want to limit how much I as an individual can give you. And we wound up getting into very long seminars and things that we hosted with Creative Coalition. We worked with them many years ago. These public information things about public financing of campaigns. And what you need in this society, and this is spit in the ocean compared to some of the other things we spend exorbitant amounts of money in this country, was you needed to have a media paradigm where you can spend whatever you want to spend on the campaign. But as long as I hit a certain floor, if we calculate the media saturation for a statewide race in the state of New York is $26 million, all we have to make sure is that everybody has $26 million in public financing. If you're going to have a cycle that's a presidential cycle, or an off-year cycle would be less money, what is it, $3-4 billion in the presidential cycle nationwide, $5-6 billion every 4 years, and then an additional $3 or $4 billion, half that other. So what? So it's $10 billion spent every 4 years, presumably, to guarantee, I take that back, not to guarantee, but to aid and abet the cause of clean elections. We talked about the Harvard and the Shorenstein Center and the 9 Sundays program and all the things that it turns out maybe didn't have as much. Shorenstein, Marvin Kalb ran that center, and they wanted the 9 consecutive Sundays prior to the election to have debates. Well, now 9 debates seems like a prelude compared to what we have now with this crowd. But I just wanted to say it was interesting to me, because I'm leading up to a question for you. I'm going to ask each of them some kind of semi-biographical questions. I learned a lot from those guys. And your organization is a wonderful organization which provides a tremendous service to people. And I was wondering, how did you get involved with them?
I should say, well, I used to run a super PAC. No.
And you went to jail.
Then I went to jail. I'm a lawyer. I worked in politics and government. I was chief speechwriter for President Bill Clinton, worked for him for 2 full terms. Worked on these issues of democracy reform. I always said that's why I needed a job as a speechwriter, so I had something else on my resume. And got to see how you could move the public, how you could make policy, and the need for change. And I was a lawyer in private practice, and the opportunity to go to the Brennan Center opened up 11 years ago. And it was a really neat institution. It's partly a think tank and partly a legal advocacy group and partly a communications hub. And it was started by the family and clerks of Justice Brennan. It's affiliated with NYU. And we have the great privilege of being able to say what we're working on is looking at the systems of democracy and justice and trying to find ways to reform and revitalize them. So it's a never-ending challenge. We work on money in politics, on voting rights, on redistricting, on criminal justice reform, and a whole host of other things.
All right. We're going to take a chance to ask each of these guys a question about their individual careers, but I wanted to get back to some of these burning questions I have here, which is when you look at, we talked backstage about how the Republicans are obviously stalling Garland's nomination, but I think everybody agreed that if the situation were reversed, that the Democrats would be doing the exact same thing.
I agree with that. I'm not sure there's perfect consensus on that point. You may
let it rip, fellas.
May hear some different points of view. I think that if the ideological balance of the court is at stake, and you have some hope of it not flipping on you for a generation, you might want to pay the political price, which the Republicans, I think, are paying, of going an entire year with an empty seat on the court. And bear in mind, too, that even if everything moves fairly quickly once we have a new president, the new justice, Merrick Garland or whoever it is going to participate in vanishingly few cases, and we're going to have a second entire term of an 8-member court muddling along. And we already have signs of what a terrible journalistic term it's going to be, because they've taken almost no good cases, because the good cases they don't want to take if they know they're going to deadlock anyway.
And the significance of this is really unusual in American history. And justices sometimes change and move around in their philosophical approach over time, but just looking at which political party appointed the justices, the Republicans appointed the majority of the justices from about the Civil War till about 1937. Then it was the Democrats till about 1972, and since then it's been the Republicans. And the last Chief Justice to be appointed by a Democratic president was by Harry Truman. And this is at a time when the Democrats win plenty of presidential elections, Republicans too. So it really is understandable that people would fight very hard over this very small turf.
I think that, I know we have a little bit of a different view on it. I think that at the end of the day, I think Republicans were willing to shut down the government over funding for Planned Parenthood. So they are very willing to shut down the justice system to keep a seat open. I mean, I do think certainly both sides play the political game. We've been in the nominations business at People For ever since the Robert Bork hearing days. And there are both sides, but at the end of the day, I think people on the left they want a functioning government. I don't think they're willing to say, let's just hold seats open. It would not surprise me if there were additional vacancies and they thought they could keep the seats open, that we would just go on a diminishing number. I mean, it's not inconceivable that there could be 7 and then 6. I mean, that they could just say, we're not doing it. I mean, if you talk to some of these senators, I mean, they are not willing to say yes to people that they feel, and you look at what they're saying, look at their remarks, look at their supporters who were saying, if you allow anybody on that court who's progressive to change the direction of the court, then we will get you out of office as soon as we can. Trump has been an incredible, I would say probably help in this, because when they first were keeping it open, they said, let's let the voters decide, which seemed kind of like the best argument that was, that they had. And you could kind of understand it in a way. I mean, we fought hard against that argument. But now it's not just let the voters decide. It is, if Donald Trump gets elected, we want him to appoint Supreme Court justices. It's a very different discussion. And that's different for different communities. I mean, for example, the Latino community has now heard that Donald Trump thinks that a judge of Mexican descent is unqualified because he's going to be biased, and so can't sit even on his case regarding Trump University. So the fact that he's not going to appoint somebody to the Supreme Court, that's very profound. And the fact that it's still gone on, and we're now at the longest vacancy ever in terms of a nomination. It's now been sitting, I think, 159 days. Is really, that part of it is unprecedented. I mean, that has not happened before.
What's Garland's path to the court now?
Well, so let me indulge in a hypothetical. A rational Republican Party would, the moment it's clear that Hillary is going to win or has won, perhaps in the lame duck, should take Merrick Garland, who is 1, an extremely able judge, 2, 63 years old, far older than your typical nominee, and as moderate a nominee as any Democratic president is going to appoint. You should take this gift and confirm him the moment Hillary, the election returns are in, if she wins. But that presupposes, as I said, a rational Republican Party, and they've dug themselves in pretty deep to say they're not going to do that. So it would require Mitch McConnell to eat some words. The next step in the progress is after we have a new Senate, and the chances of the Senate flipping, I'm told, are reasonably high. And at that point, the Democrats face an interesting question of, do you go with poor Merrick Garland, who has endured this endless wait, or do you let a President Clinton appoint someone who's not 63 but 45 and who's more liberal? The Democratic convention managed to go 4 days without the words Merrick Garland being uttered, so I don't think he's a favorite of the left. So there becomes a bunch of game theory depending on what happens in the election in the Senate.
Including whether Hillary will continue with Garland, correct?
That's right.
And there's a chance, and you don't rule out, each of the three, you would tell me what you think are the possibilities, whether she goes with him or replaces him.
Right now, she's being very quiet because, of course, it gives her much more leverage in getting Garland through now to not say she'll reappoint him. And there are file folders full of quotes from Republican lawmakers over the years saying, as Orrin Hatch said, well, if President Obama appointed somebody wonderful like Merrick Garland, well, obviously we'd confirm him, but he's not going to do that. He's a communist, so we don't have to worry about that. I think that the question for her is whether she wants to expend, were she to win and were the Democrats to control the Senate, would she want to expend so much political capital right at the very beginning in what might be only her first nomination? The other significant thing is, as you may know, there was such a blockade of lower court judges that the Democrats changed the filibuster rules for lower court judges, but they did not change them for Supreme Court justices. If there's an ahistorical and unconstitutional blockade of all Supreme Court justices, they may well end this filibuster.
How many judicial nominations are blocked still, even now for Is it still,
Not
they've
many.
been
I
moving
mean, I
those
believe
along?
there's 26 seats
That log
that are open,
jam
but
has opened up
but
a
that's
bit?
been very much opened up.
It has been.
I just want to add, though,
Go right
too,
ahead.
that I think if the Senate it does flip control, I think there's a very low chance that their obstruction will be nominated, will be basically acknowledged and rewarded by getting a chance to approve them again. I just think that there's going to be very little chance that they want to say, great, you kept this seat open for 10 months, and now, here's your reward. We'll give you another swipe at him. I mean, I think he's eminently qualified. I think he would probably be approved in a lame duck, but there's even a chance, and I think everybody's got to, pressure their senators and politicians to have them do their job, because I think there's a chance that if they think they're going to save their own skin, that they will, there's a chance he might get approved, in September. There's been a lot of discussion about that. And by the way, Mitch McConnell is the least popular politician in America. He's 11% approval rating. President Obama is now recently as high as 55. It's not a popular thing. Mitch McConnell's not popular, and there's going to be a lot of ads. They're going to be in states that are showing Mitch McConnell supporting these senators and supporting the obstruction.
On a personal note, how long have you been involved with People Forward, and how did you get involved with them, and why?
And I've got a note. I was going to say, this election has gotten a lot of energy from the creative community, and I just want to acknowledge Alec, who has been doing this work. For People for the American Way, he's been on our board forever and doing this on so many range of issues for decades. So I want to acknowledge that. Thank you. You're not a Johnny come lately.
And to be completely fair and completely transparent here, I'm on the board of People for the American Way. I'm a contributor to the Brennan Center, and I read the New York Times. So, online and in print. Here we go.
By the way, and the right wing thinks that Alec controls everything. So it's full disclosure on that. But I got involved with People for the American Way. I was living in Los Angeles. I was on the founding national board of GLAAD back in the early days of the movement. And People for the American Way was very smartly putting together people and connecting the dots for different organizations and different causes, and saying, the right wing doesn't think in silos. It thinks in the movement overall, and we've got a very common enemy. And we're putting people together, and I got involved, and I thought that was a really great thing. Joined the board over 20 years ago, and was happily a board member, and then was tapped to head the organization 7 years ago, and it's been a great joy, because that's what we're still doing. It's really trying to combine the fact that we're all in this together, and it's not just, okay, women's rights over there, voting rights over there, people who are in the LGBT community over there, and fight for your own. It's really been about tying things together. So that's what we're doing now. We're doing lots in the Latino vote, getting out the vote, much more than we ever did before, because we realize, again, you got to win by winning and empowering people to vote. We do lots in the African American vote, youth vote, and Latinos are kind of our big strengths now. People Forward was also started when I was thinking about this panel. One of the reasons that it was founded 35 years ago was the rise of the religious right, and Jimmy Swaggart making the statement when he was praying, saying he was praying for the removal of a Supreme Court justice. That was shocking at the time, the fact that people that were using their prayer and their organizing around changing the Supreme Court. The left had to wake up, and this was part of it. So.
I played Jimmy Swaggart in a movie, by the way. It's even more of a 6 degrees of separation. This is a pretty, kind of an armchair question, but I'm nonetheless interested to hear what you three think about this, and that is, what are the decisions that you think of, just pick one, or just say whatever you want to say, quite frankly, but what you think have been the most interesting / impactful decisions of this court during the Obama years, and what was a decision that either surprised or outright stunned you, if at all? Let's begin with Adam.
So the decision that really transformed the democracy issues that Michael was talking about was a case called Shelby County, where the court struck down the heart of the Voting Rights Act, a statute that transformed America, for which people bled and died which required states with a history of discrimination to get federal approval before they changed voting laws, voter ID laws, stuff like that. And the moment that part of the Voting Rights Act fell, we saw what we're seeing playing out now, which is lots and lots of efforts to make it harder to vote. So that was, along with Citizens United, Shelby County, a really transformative decision.
And inside the writing of the decisions that were written about Shelby County, was there this sense, was the text of it along the lines of the court, of the authors of that decision, saying things like, well, no, these are states' rights issues and they're going to do just fine, and that we don't need federal oversight of this, and they're going to be, and we're wrong to assume they can't have fair election laws on their own.
There was a lot of that, and at the argument, John Roberts, who ended up writing the decision, kept saying, do you really think Mississippi's more prejudiced than Connecticut today? And there was a flaw. You may have a view. There was a flaw in the renewal of the Voting Rights Act, which is Congress, because it didn't want to open old wounds, relied on a very old formula to decide who was in and who was out. And that was the pressure point Roberts went after. Roberts said, I'm not saying you could never require federal approval for some but not all states, but you can't rely on really old data. So here again is an instance where a properly functioning Congress could go back and say, okay, we hear you. We're going to have a fresh look at where we really need this kind of federal preclearance, as they say in the jargon, and have another go at it. But of course, Congress is incapable of doing anything.
And then what happened in North Carolina?
Well, I think the underlying, you're right that Chief Justice Roberts, his argument was basically that was then, this is now, and it's picking on the wrong states in effect. Justice Scalia was the one who in the courtroom said that the problem with the Voting Rights Act was it was, quote, a racial entitlement. And that was underlying a lot of the actual animus toward the Voting Rights Act, Section 5. Justice Ginsburg had that wonderful dissent in that case where she said, that's like saying that that there are no more prejudice, that people are voting at high rates, African Americans are voting at a very high rate in the South, is like standing in a rainstorm with an umbrella and not getting wet and concluding, well, therefore I don't need an umbrella. Within hours, states that had previously been blocked began changing their voting laws. In Texas, 2 hours later, they put into effect the notorious voter ID law there, which says that you cannot use your University of Texas ID as a government ID, but you can use your concealed carry gun permit. North Carolina, it passed sort of a greatest hits voting law with all the things that some of us consider voter suppression policies all at once. And that was, along with all these other laws, in the last month, appeals courts across the country, Democrat and Republican judges, state and federal, blocked these laws. In North Carolina, the appeals court, federal appeals court, said that that law was written with almost surgical precision to cut out black voters.
I would also add to those cases, on the positive side, there were, Obamacare was not killed, which was important. Marriage equality was also passed, but and we're very worried that people are going to say, oh, well, this court is really deciding, very even-handedly. But one thing to add to that is that one thing certainly we have found by studying the cases, I guess, is the last 10 years, there's been 150 5-4 cases, which is an unprecedented number. I mean, back in the day, you all are more expert in that, but there were many fewer cases. But they've generally come down around siding with corporations. There are, like marriage equality was passed in terms of giving certain rights, the Voting Rights Act, which was horribly, denying other rights. But really, when you look at the case law, it has really become the corporate court, and really deciding on the powerful, with the powerful and with the moneyed interest over, regular citizens. And I think that's something to be concerned about.
When you get involved, when I was younger, it was about campaigns and candidacies, and your political efficacy always migrated toward, when I lived part of my life in Los Angeles and raising money for Tom Hayden when he was in California and back in the 80s, and the different and distinct campaigns I was involved in. And then as I've gotten older, those activities seem almost numbingly less significant to me, except for the idea of the effect that these elections will have on the court. And we do see, in our society, that, as was hinted to before, what kind of a litigious society we live in, whether you get that from Tocqueville or whatever, that we live in a society in which there's right and wrong, and then there's the law. And the law says that corporations can do this and that, and there's things that we think instinctually know are wrong, but they're legal. And if the case gets heard, which is a monumentally difficult thing to do, is to get a case before the court, it seems, then once, if it's not decided, or if it is decided, it remains the law in that way. And I was wondering, for each of you, why do you think, how would you evaluate, let me say more fairly, how would you evaluate the average American's understanding of the role of the court in our society? And how well are we doing, each of you? Because I think that's the thing each of you has in common. The one thing that you have in common, the three of you, is in your own way, your goal, or among your goals, is to educate your constituency about the role of the court and that role. How well do you think you're doing? Let's start with you.
See, I think that the public may not understand the minutia of dissents and opinions, or even how many justices there are. But we do, as Americans, share this reverence for the Constitution, this reverence for the principles of the Declaration of Independence before that, and this idea that, broadly speaking, it isn't all just politics. But I'll actually say something that somebody from a legal organization might not always have felt comfortable saying. I actually think that the most important court to win in on these matters is the court of public opinion. That is what has undergirded all the major changes in doctrine in the Supreme Court. The work you do, the work we all do to educate the public and to win voters over. It used to be the idea that, on the liberal side certainly, you'd hear people say, oh, nobody cares about that stuff. This is process. It's not a kitchen table issue. People aren't sitting around talking about the Constitution at their kitchen table. You'll hear that from the Democratic political consultants who I always worked with. Well, tell it to the NRA. Tell it to the anti-abortion movement. They understand that there are tens of millions of people who care passionately about what the Constitution says. So it really is a matter of winning in that much broader public debate that you are part of and that everybody here can be a part of, that ultimately decides what the Supreme Court or any other court does.
And Justice Ginsburg will say, to follow on, that the court doesn't follow the daily political weather, but it follows the climate of the age. That it's inconceivable that the same-sex marriage decision would have come down a decade ago. And it seemed to be completely in step with people's understandings of what they wanted in their society and how they understood the Constitution a year or two ago. So in that sense, the court does follow public opinion to an extent. Does the public know very much about the court? I'm probably not doing my job because, no, I don't think so. I flatter myself to think I do a reasonable job at telling readers of the New York Times what the court is up to. But I think the average American follows it only very lightly, could name maybe 2 or 3 cases, Roe v. Wade, Bush v. Gore, Citizens United, Miranda, wouldn't probably be able to tell you in any detail what those cases meant. The polling suggests that they think to this day that the court is liberal rather than conservative as it is. So in many, many ways, the public doesn't understand the court, but, and maybe this is the key point, they do respect the authority and legitimacy of the court. Justice Breyer, a liberal in dissent in Bush v. Gore, likes to say that it was very important that the day after Bush v. Gore came down, there were not riots in the street. There was a generally accepted view, unhappy though a lot of people were, that the Supreme Court has spoken, that's the end of it, it's the indispensable American institution, it characterizes who we are as Americans. We may not like every decision, but we'd rather have them making these decisions than say, well, I'm not going to say.
Yeah, I would add, I think things have changed though this year. I mean, it's been frustrating over a long period of time of trying to get people to care about the courts, and you kind of hope and you do these polls and you find that it's down on the list, or even when it's up on the list, you don't know that people actually go in and vote around the courts. But we just did some polling with some partner groups relatively recently, and it was interesting to find what the American people thought. Number one, there were 50% of the people thought the Supreme Court and who was naming the Supreme Court justices was in their top two issues. It was only behind the economy. Significant. Also, what's amazing, there was a huge gap on the conservative side and the liberal side before. Now they're almost even in terms of who cares about the courts. That has changed dramatically. And that's up 20 points from 2012, just the last election. So I think really, really important. The other thing I wanted to add, though, too, is I think that different communities get it in different ways. Yes, there's mainstream America, but being in front of the Supreme Court after the DACA decision, that's the immigration executive order that was not upheld. I mean, to see the impact of those lives, and here were, mainly Latinos out there who really saw the impact of the Supreme Court. I think the LGBT community gets the fact that the religious freedom, which is now this big issue, and restrictions on religious liberty, quote unquote, the marriage decision. I mean, I think there are different communities that get it, and people who care about reproductive rights. I mean, that's been on the chopping block for a very long time, and it's important. It's an important issue for different communities. But I was also saying that I think that we're seeing in this election, and particularly with Donald Trump, I mean, the contrast could not be more clear, that usually we are trying to say that elections impact the courts. But this time, the courts could impact elections. And that's the first time I think we can really say that. And so I think it's important to help make it an issue, but I think we have the wind at our backs. These senators that are running in swing states, the polling found that 2-to-1 people thought senators should do their job. I mean, the Kelly Ayotts in New Hampshire and the John McCain's in states like Arizona should be doing their job. And that was Republicans and Democrats. I think it's a different year, and we could be looking back and say that this was a time when there was a big shift in electoral politics regarding the courts.
Before we get to our last couple of questions, and I want to say, I don't think we're taking questions from the audience, and now I feel badly. We did that as a time consideration. And now I feel badly because you seem like such a nice group of people. Maybe we should have taken just a couple. Maybe we will take. Do we have a hot mic we can get out here? Is that possible? Am I allowed to change my mind? Doesn't the Constitution say I can have a mic? I want Adam to talk about your career prior to what you were doing and how you came to be the Supreme Court correspondent.
I took a weird path. I always wanted to be a journalist. I was on my college paper. I was a copy boy at the New York Times in the early 80s. And then I got it into my head to go off to law school and thought maybe some way I could wind my way back. But what I did first was work at a Wall Street firm for 4 years doing First Amendment work. And then for 10 years, I was an in-house lawyer at the New York Times Company, sort of reading cases for libel and so on. So for 14 years, I took a left turn into the law. And then I was giving advice to Howell Raines, then the executive editor of the Times, one day, and he said to me, "How'd you like to be the national legal correspondent?" And I thought that was an idiotic idea. I didn't have the skill set, the background, whatever, but I said yes. I remember when I wrote him a note the next day saying, "Yeah, I'll take the job." I thought I must have misheard it because I really didn't have the beginnings of the ability to start at the New York Times on the national desk covering the law. But anyway, I covered the law for 6 or 7 years in New York on the national desk and really enjoyed the hell out of that. And roamed the country and found stories nobody else was writing about and wrote some series and started a column, and I was happy. And then Linda Greenhouse, towering figure in American legal journalism, decides she's going to retire from covering the Supreme Court. Terrible news for Adam Liptak. I don't want to move to Washington. I don't want to cover a court that's well covered by, to this day, 25 excellent journalists, all of whom write the same story every day. I don't want to follow Linda. But nonetheless, I couldn't figure out how to say no to what is the best job in American legal journalism. And in 2008, moved to Washington, started covering the court, and thank God have found it incredibly satisfying, gratifying. You get better at it as you go along, and I've tried to find different ways to write not only about cases and decisions, but about the culture of the court and the consequences of its decisions and so on. So it's been fun, and all I regret is that I was a lawyer for 14 years before I became a journalist.
We mentioned, we're going to do that in a second. We mentioned, you mentioned Bush v. Gore, and we talked backstage briefly about the possibility, maybe not in identical terms, but the possibility of Trump v. Clinton. What was your opinion about that?
Well, it would have to be pretty darn close to have a case like that. There are a number of the voting rights cases that could still get up to the court and have rulings before November, although the court is likely to push them away and say it's too close. In many instances, it's too close to the election to change the rules in effect. One of the things that's really different this time, and that challenges all of us and challenges journalism and has even challenged Supreme Court justices as they've commented on the elections, is we've never had a major party nominee. Donald Trump commented on these rulings where federal courts and state courts block these voting laws. And he said, oh, that means the election is rigged. His supporter, Roger Stone, said, oh, yeah, we're going to have, if Trump loses Florida, it means it was stolen. We're going to have civil disobedience and a constitutional crisis. Because of these court rulings on the nature of our democracy, we've never had that before, honestly, in at least a century in this country. And it's hard for us all to process it and how to respond to it, except to speak out and say that is not the norm. So it's already entangled with the election.
So instead of Trump v. Gore, we'll have Trump v. Clinton. We'll have Trump assault Clinton if he loses Florida or Pennsylvania. What's your opinion about Trump?
So, I mean, another really terrible part of all this thought experiment is it's an 8-member court. So it's should we have a Trump v. Clinton analog to Bush v. Gore, and it gets to the court, you can imagine them deadlocking and leaving in place the happenstance of whatever panel in the Fifth Circuit or somebody decided the fate of the Republic. That's horrible. Now, there's some right-wingers who think that Justice Ginsburg, who made some candid comments to me and to some other journalists, might have to recuse herself from that case, where at least you'd have a 7-member court and they could come to a decision.
I was going to add to what Michael said, and Trump was a little more specific in Pennsylvania, where he said the only way he could lose Pennsylvania is if there was voting fraud in certain areas. It was pretty clear where those certain areas that he thought the voter fraud was going to be happening, and so I think it's really important that we...
Bucks County?
Yeah. I am concerned, though, this legacy of a very big chunk of our country thinking that this election will be rigged no matter what happens and I think it's going to be a real challenge to kind of get back to we're all in this together and this is all one America and trying to get people to realize that just because you lose doesn't mean that you've been cheated. Actually, and also going back to the point which I think is very interesting in conservative legal circles, there's been, particularly in the last few weeks, a surprising number of legal experts on the conservative side who were saying, actually, Trump may not be worth it.
No, that's
which
what I'm
is
hearing.
Shocking to hear, because it's always been, people kind of go to their sides and say, at the end of the day, I don't like my candidate, but they're going to support certain justices that I will support. But a lot of them have said, A, it may not be worth it because you got all the other stuff with Trump. But also, interestingly, that they don't trust that he's going to pick somebody off the list that he was given. I thought one conservative scholar made a great analogy. He said, what if Trump doesn't get his first choice and he uses the art of the deal and says, I'll give you that justice. If you give me 6 justices on the lower courts, I'll give you whoever you want. I mean, there's a lack of trust there, and I think this is certainly the first time that's ever happened.
I think the conservative legal establishment has given up on Donald Trump. That's not true of the conservative political establishment. But people who are serious about the law and the Constitution don't want him, don't trust him, thinks that he does not believe in the rule of law. And even if he were to put the ideal conservative judicial candidate onto the Supreme Court, they still don't want him. Now, that's a small subset of the general conservative community, but with vanishingly few exceptions, people like John Yoo, he of the torture memos, say, not Donald Trump, please.
What is it they say on Twitter when someone says a retweet doesn't necessarily mean endorsement? Okay. So we're going to do a little quick poll. So your participation in this poll does not necessarily indicate an endorsement. applaud, and if you don't want to, you don't have to applaud if you believe Trump still has a chance to win the election. Applaud if you think Trump has little or no chance to win the election. This is interesting. I mean, setting aside the court and the parameters of the court, I wanted each of you to comment about that. About the court would be. Let me go back for a second, and we will take a couple questions quickly. But let me just go back for a second because I don't know the histories of all of the people on the court. I know a bit about Alito, and I know a bit about Roberts and so forth. I know that Ginsburg is very old, and most people who assume that especially if Clinton wins, or maybe either way, she'll retire when this is over, because she's how old now, Ginsburg? 83. Who's the next oldest member of the court?
Kennedy, 80.
Right, so you would assume, there's a bit of morbidity, I think, it may be involved in this assessment, but how many appointments do you think the next president will get?
Well, so you've listed 2, which actuarially seem possible. Breyer's 78. So you have 3 members of the court who are older.
Will be in their 80s in the first term.
Right. It's critical.
And the average retirement age is what, 78? So if you want to take that as break even.
Now, when we talked about Adam mentioned about they are aware of public opinion on the court, and they do sometimes take that into, if I'm quoting you correctly, they do take that in as a factor. And when I did the work that I did many years ago, again with Bert Newborn at the Brennan Center, he had a wonderful phrase that he said that I told backstage. He said that when Brown versus the Board of Education was voted on in the 1950s, he said the court didn't arrive that day to cast that vote having any new information. Everything was known. He said, but when they assembled to cast that vote, they realized that the country was ready for this change. It was time, the time had come for this change. And I'm wondering, my last question for the 3 of you is, what if Hillary Clinton does indeed win, and we do have a liberal court, I hate that word, but I mean a liberal court back in the swing of it, what do you think the country's ready for next? What cases would you imagine a Hillary Clinton White House would, or the political zeitgeist under Hillary Clinton would want to bring to the court?
Well, I do think that the Citizens United,
right,
the country is already there. It is by far the most unpopular decision among Republicans and Democrats of any major recent case of which I'm aware. But the court isn't going to read a bumper sticker and read a poll and walk in one day and announce, you know what, we've changed our minds, we know it's no longer good law. There have to actually be cases brought. There have to be laws enforced that someone challenges as unconstitutional, or new laws passed. I think it is very possible that the court will chip away at Citizens United for a long while, not a long while, but rather energetically in a number of cases rather than going at it the first day. And it's a challenge for liberals, for progressives. For a long time, progressives were the people in America who were against judicial activism. It was the judges who were striking down the New Deal, who were striking down the progressive laws. Then it was the conservatives in the Warren Court era who didn't like the civil rights laws and other things, and they were against judicial activism. Will the progressives just come back in and suddenly decide they no longer care? I think that progressives have to find a way of enhancing and supporting and enforcing constitutional rights without falling into the trap of of thinking everything should be a judicial decision, because among other things, that helps create a backlash in the public against even the best ideas.
Adam.
So transgender rights are moving very fast, and I expect those cases to get to the court, and a court with 5 Democratic appointees will be sympathetic to many of those claims. Another area we haven't talked about at all, but Alec mentioned a little bit that this is a very pro-business court. I would imagine that a court dominated by Democratic appointees would start to cut away at 2 of the main ways the court has made life difficult for consumers and employees, which is to make it difficult to file class actions and to force people into arbitrations. And I think both of those are areas where you could see some action.
Well, let me just put a button on that, which is that we live in a society, and I mean this is a very generalizing statement to make, but we live in a society, my view of America now is we give people, they can have all the guns they want, they can have all the pills they want, and then we've privatized the prison system, and we've got more people incarcerated in this country than ever before. And there seems to be a lot of problems with that. I understand that the privatized penal system is maybe going to start making an exit in this country, but what's the role of the Supreme Court in terms of changing criminal law? I believe the criminal law in this country needs to change.
Part of it is constitutional and part of it is statutory. So the Supreme Court can't do very much about mandatory minimums if Congress chooses to enact those laws. That has to come, with some political might. But the court can do a lot of stuff, say in the area of the Fourth Amendment, where issues that the Black Lives Matter movement has shown a spotlight on often have a constitutional aspect that the court could easily intercede in, although even this 8-member court in this last term was fairly conservative on a couple of major criminal procedure issues.
I think the religious liberty issue is going to be a very big one going forward because it's now in states and it's bubbling up in terms of what rights do people have as a religion if their religion says they have the right to discriminate. I think there's also been, we were talking about Citizens United, that concept of can corporations really have religious rights? Are they able to say that we don't want to give contraception? I think there might be continuing pressure in that regard in the courts going forward.
Do we want to take a question? Do you have a really good, and I do want to emphasize, but I call this the 92nd Street Y rule. Some of you may need what I'm talking about. No statements, please. No getting up to the microphone and pontificating for 20 minutes. How has Thomas changed since Scalia died?
And might he resign? So Clarence Thomas, after 10 years of silence, about a week and a half after Justice Scalia died, spoke from the bench, asked questions from the bench for the first time in a Second Amendment case, and apparently feeling that his colleague wasn't there to do the work, he was going to do it. So clearly, that was a major change. There was a wholly unfounded rumor that Thomas was thinking about resigning. The chances of Clarence Thomas voluntarily resigning in a Hillary Clinton administration is south of zero. He still bears the scars of a brutal confirmation process, and he would not give the Democratic Senate the satisfaction of confirming his replacement.
At the end over here. Let's pass that to.
Would any of you support some sort of a tenure, maximum tenure for Supreme Court justices?
Term limits.
Or an age cutoff at any point?
I don't. We've looked at it pretty closely. I think that is basically the wrong solution to some problem. I mean, I don't think it really solves any of the problems that the Supreme Court has had. I don't know that it gives that many advantages. I don't know if you all maybe thought to come up with a different.
Every counterpart to the Supreme Court around the world does have long fixed limits like 18 years or mandatory retirement ages. And I think when the framers thought about life tenure, they didn't realize that John Paul Stevens would live to be 90. So I think there are good policy arguments for making a change, but since it would require a constitutional amendment, it's an academic discussion only.
And it's worth noting that many state Supreme Courts have some version of that, although we have not, I should say, taken a close look at it.
We have this gentleman here. We only have time for a couple more quick ones. Right here.
In one of the Citizens United related cases, did they talk about international influence through big corporate donations or the appearance of it at all? I'm just not sure.
There was a follow-on case involving, I think, Canadian citizens who wanted to spend or donate, and the court let stand a lower court decision saying that's no good. So even though Citizens United itself left open the possibility of foreign money coming in, and you recall President Obama in 2010 said that was a problem with the logic of Citizens United, I think the court has already spoken in a small way and would certainly, even the old 9-member court, would not go for that.
And we saw Alito mouthing the words not true. Which shows that there was a lot of confusion on that.
But what has happened after Citizens United and a number of other things is that right now there's effectively been considerable or close to full deregulation of the role of money in politics, and more of it is undisclosed. Dark money is something folks are familiar with. It's the use, in effect, of phony nonprofits to disguise who's making political expenditures. We found something that we call gray money, which is that it looks like it's disclosed, and it turns out it's coming from a PAC that's given to a PAC that's given to a PAC, and we actually don't know who's giving that money and whether it's all domestic or legal.
We have a question over here, sir.
Yeah, do you think that Barack Obama has any chance of getting on the Supreme Court, and would he take it?
He's qualified. He has said he's not interested, and it requires a certain kind of temperament. Even though the current crop of Supreme Court justices seem to, will be willing to attend the opening of an envelope, and they're at every bar association around the country. Nonetheless, you're basically sitting in your chambers with your law clerks, and it's quite cloistered. And someone with a political temperament would not be suited to that.
William Howard Taft did it, but he seems like he may be temperamentally a little different from President Obama.
Yes.
Is there any probability that Hillary Clinton would in fact nominate a more liberal judge to the Supreme Court than Garland? And
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think there's a very good chance. And I also think, too, if they take back the Senate, if the Democrats take back the Senate, I think, and the rules are changed, I think there's a very good chance. And there's also, going back to that groundswell thing, in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, they were doing many other things, Obamacare and all the rest of it. There was very little attention, energy around senators approving judges. I think that has changed. That certainly changed after the 2014 election when the whole slew of them were approved during lame duck. I think there's going to be a greater appetite because, by the way, it seems like it's just as hard to get a liberal judge through as a moderate you don't get any more votes. I mean, Elena Kagan got, 5 votes? And she was not any great liberal. 5 Republican votes, and she was eminently qualified. I think it's hard to get anybody through, so you may as well get somebody good.
I want to just say 2 things. We have no more time. I just want to say, if I didn't call on you, that is my constitutional right not to call on you. and for you to pose a question. And also, I want to just finish by saying, we have is that you, Layla? I can't see with my the Hamptons Institute was the project of our late chairman of the board here, Mickey Strauss, and he and his wife very graciously helped to fund that project. And I want to thank Layla Strauss, who's here with us tonight, who tried to carry on the program that was started by her husband. And I want to just finish by saying, understanding the court, you don't have to plumb an understanding of the court to the degree that these gentlemen do, but understanding the court leads to, I think, the purest understanding of how this country really works. The court, through decisions that they render or decisions that they decide not to render, it decides what we do, what we say, what we listen to, what we eat. The Supreme Court is in our lives in a way that the Congress would like to be. The Congress tries to be, but the court is ultimately the greater arbiter, in my opinion. And the way that you can deepen that understanding of the court, and again, you don't have to go as far as there, is to go to the websites and read about the great work that's being done in analyzing the court, to go to the website of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School, or People for the American Way, or to read Adam Liptak's column in the New York Times. So my thanks to all 3 of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for what you